to my own presentation, my contribution to the panel, which is an argument that the courts are struggling to uphold the rule of law. And in my view, this struggle is not representative of any shortcomings or incompetencies of the judiciary itself, but more so two other factors. Firstly, it's the head of states and the caretaker prime minister's exploitation of the deep reverence deep reverence and respect that the judiciary have for them, which arises not only from democratic principles such as the separation of powers, but also for Samoa. And the second is that there's a lack of adequate checks and balances on executive power, which are being exploited as well. So in terms of that first reason for the court struggle to uphold the rule of law, we see the court's deep reverence and respect for the head of state in all their judgments regarding the legality or the constitutionality of the head of state's proclamations. In the first decision regarding their first proclamation, that new elections were to be held. We see the court state first and foremost that even though they did not have the powers to call for elections, that nothing in the judgment should be taken as criticism towards the head of state, but more so than adequate legal advice that they're receiving from the Attorney General or elsewhere. And we see them explicitly recommend for independent, publicly funded legal advice. And we see it most recently with that decision that I mentioned, where the Supreme Court showed more grace and deference in giving the head of state and HRPP 7 days to convene. And we see no attacks or no critiques or criticisms of the head of state for their actions so far. We see just another chance. And unfortunately, that has not been reciprocated, where we see the head of state come out later saying, no, you do not have the authority to convene parliament, only I do. And the Supreme Court recently said that proclamation to extend the convening of Parliament to the 2nd of August is unconstitutional, and the head of state is again wrong, but has referred all remedies for those unconstitutional acts to the Court of Appeal, where arguments have been heard, but we haven't heard the decision. I think it's probably due out next week. And so the exploitation in terms of comes from two sources, not only respect for democratic principles, separation of powers, where the separation of powers in a democracy, in order to work, requires some respect for the rule of law, even if it's disgruntled respect. We see that in Aotearoa, in classic cases such as Fitzgerald and Muldoon, but even though Muldoon, through a hissy fit, he didn't go out of his way to disregard the court's orders and try to supervene them, and most recently with Borrowdale. But unfortunately, there is no such regard in Samoa amongst the head of state and the caretaker prime minister. And the other source comes from Wha Samoa, where in order for Wha Samoa to work, there needs to be respect, mutual respect for reciprocity, and a nurturing of the sacred relational space, the VAR between individuals, people and groups. And unfortunately, those values have been disregarded as well. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but moving on to the second reason for the struggle, which is the lack of checks and balances on executive power, which is really putting the courts in a bind at the moment. The biggest, I guess, weakness in the constitutional arrangements at the moment is that Constitutional Amendment Act 2020, one of the three controversial acts, which set up a Judicial Services Commission that's made up mostly of the executive that has the power to remove judges as they see fit without any due reason. And at the moment we see that the Judicial Service Commission has been constituted, but as of yesterday, they have not been able to reach a consensus as to whether to investigate the complaint of incompetency. So that's comforting news, but it's still something to watch. How am I doing for time? Okay. In terms of how to move forward, I don't really have the solutions to this constitutional crisis. I think that, if anything, what's needed is courage and bravery amongst the judiciary and members of the public service and Samoans as well. We see an uptake of that with recent marches, and we will see whether the courts have taken that on board with the recent with the upcoming Court of Appeal decision. But I have faith and hope that this will be resolved, hopefully by the end of this year, by Christmas. And so clear things to do moving forward to stop this from ever happening again is repealing those three controversial acts which undermine the rule of law. I also think there needs to be some more political changes to the electoral system to avoid the courts being put in the situation. So, for example, I think there needs to be set terms on the Prime Minister's terms, so limitations on the number of terms that a Prime Minister can have, kind of based off the US, because unfortunately we see in Samoa that this is a problem that people can become accustomed and entitled to power, and when it's challenged, disregard all democratic principles in the process. And the other change I'd like to see is the introduction of an MMP type system for more robust parliament to prevent acts like the Constitutional Amendment Act, like the three acts that were passed last year, to stop those sorts of acts from being enacted, for there to be more chance for an opposition to have input and to put proper controls on executive power. So that is me. Apologies if I went over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Iati. Dr. Iati is a senior lecturer at the School of History, Philosophy, Political Science and International Relations here at Te Herangauaka, Victoria University of Wellington. And amongst other things, he researches in the areas of New Zealand foreign policy, Pacific geopolitics, governance and development. You're very welcome.
All right, I'd just like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to give this talk. I appreciate it's a really sensitive topic, so I just want to make clear from the beginning, I take a very neutral perspective on this. I'm not for one side or the other. If my research or conclusions seem to favour one side, that's not my intention. I've approached this as sort of more of a question about democracy in Samoa than trying to pick a side and sort of press a particular narrative. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is from my article that was just published a few weeks ago in the New Zealand International Review, where I argued that what you've happened in Samoa is really a perfect storm for a crisis, that a number of factors have come together to form the situation that we've got now. I hear a lot of accusations against the Prime Minister, saying he's a dictator and so forth. I think those are quite unfair, given what's happened. And I am by no means someone who does not critique the Samoan government. You can read an article I wrote in 2013. I see Professor John Frankel here. He's overlook that article where I outline some of the very dubious ways that the HRPP have used to stay in power. So I just want to make my position clear that I'm not here to press a particular narrative, but I do think the narrative that's come out that Prime Minister Tulepa is a dictator, I think is a little bit unfair in lieu of any evidence at all. So with that said, let me move on to what I think has produced the situation we've got now. And you really have to start with the political environment in Samoa. And one of the things you know about the political environment in Samoa is there have been growing pockets of discontentment over the last couple of decades. And you could go back as far as the 2008 Land Titles Registration Act. And from there, you've seen a lot of sort of Samoan protests and discontentment manifest publicly in terms of marches, etc., against what Samoans thought was an act that would deprive them of their customary lands, which makes up about 80% of Samoan lands. And so you have these growing discontentments also in relation to the handling of the measles crisis, in relation to what has appeared to many a very non-transparent process by which the government has dealt with China. Okay. There have been allegations of corruption, nepotism, misappropriation of aid, particularly to do with the tsunami. So you have these different pockets of discontentment mark the political environment in Samoa. In addition to these pockets of discontentment, you've had over the past several decades a political climate that's been marked by the distrust of the HRPP. And I'd be the first to say that the HRPP have not helped themselves because there's been somewhat of a lack of transparency from their side in relation to a number of controversial policies. For example, the Land Titles Registration Act that I just mentioned, I think when it was introduced around the same time that the country moved the driving side of the road from the American side to the New Zealand side. And so a lot of people were caught up with that one, and there wasn't a lot of fanfare to do with the Land Titles Registration Act. And I remember going to Samoa, and I went to have a look at the public submissions on the Act, and I think there are only about 62 submissions, which is very little for an Act that, in my view, opens the way for the deprivation of customary lands in the country, because it introduces the torrent system and the principle of indefeasibility to the leasing of customary lands. But anyway, that's another case. In any case, so what we have then is you have these pockets of discontentment. You have a political climate marked by a significant distrust of the HRPP. And then you have what has happened in the last year and a bit, where you have three factors that kind of come together, coalesce to make for a really perfect storm to bring about this situation. And the first factor I would point to is that you have the controversial bills. And I would put it simply as this: no controversial bills, no fast. Okay, no fast party. Why do I say that? Those bills prompted or caused a separation between a number of key actors in the HRPP. And you just have to look at Laoli leaving the party, Wayne Fong, Fuimaono, leaving the party. Fia Me specifically said she left the HRPP because of the three bills. So you've got these three bills which now have sort of created this division in the political spectrum in Samoa between those for FAST and those for the HRPP. But I do want to note that a number of the key players in the FAST party or the FAST side are former HRPP. So these bills have kind of separated those sort of two sides. And when we headed into the elections, there was a really clear division as to who stood for what. I've heard some analysis say that vote splitting did not account for what happened in the election. I think that's wrong. That's based on an assumption that people vote along family lines and what their village councils tell them. That particular assumption works for previous elections. For this particular election, when we headed into the election, everyone was quite clear as to who and what FAST was standing for and what the HRPP was standing for. So that assumption did not hold for this one. And an indication of that was when the head of state said, we're going to call new elections. You'll note that the HRPP immediately decreased the number of candidates that they had running. They knew that the vote splitting had hurt them. So we have then this first factor of the three bills coming together, creating momentum for FAST to come into the election. A second factor, and I think this is really the key one for us to understand, is that we had a very vaguely drafted constitutional provision in Article 44. I think most people agree they could have done a better job in drafting this provision. And as Dylan mentioned, the two really controversial points about Article 44 is when it says minimum 10% and when it says presently 5%. Okay, so I would suggest that both parties, both FAST and the HRPP, have really compelling arguments as to why this particular article should be read either way. And it could have gone either way. And I think the judgments, first by the Supreme Court in favor of 5, and then by the Court of Appeal in favor of 6, tell us that that's how close it was in terms of interpreting this article, these articles. I think where FAST kind of lost a little bit is when the articles say minimum 10%. If you took away the word minimum, a lot of people had argued, well, you could do the rounding up. Probably if you took away the word minimum from the minimum 10%, you might have an argument that you could round up from 9.8 to 10%. But when you put the word minimum in there, it kind of sets a bar below which you cannot go. And I think that argument eventually prevailed for the HRPP with the Court of Appeal. And in their judgment, they said, does 9.8 mean 10%, minimum 10%? They said no. The other one that kind of got the FAST case in trouble was it said presently 5. Now, that was a 2019 amendment to the Constitution, and some would argue that was with a purview to the 2021 election. But the actual use of the words presently 5 in 2019 could be interpreted as, in 2019, you had 49 seats. And in 49 seats, when you have 5 for women, that accords with the minimum 10%. So those have kind of worked in the favor of the HRPP. But like I said, both sides could produce a really compelling argument for why it should be read one way or the other. It has come down to the HRPP, and regardless of whether we like it or not, the Court of Appeal has found in their favor with regards to the quota. Now, here's where things kind of get a little bit more complicated. What I've seen with the election is you've had interpretations of interpretations. You've had the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution, or the Court of Appeal interpret the Constitution, and then you have the different parties interpret the interpretations of the courts. So I think that's one thing that we've got to pay attention to. For example, when the courts found that the 6th woman would not be allowed to sit until all the petitions were held, I heard the HRPP interpreted that to mean that they can carry on in power until the 6th woman is held. FAST, of course, came out with their interpretation. So we've entered into really kind of murky waters, because you not only got the courts interpreting the Constitution, you've got the parties interpreting the interpretation of the courts. I'm not taking one side or the other. I think what we have here is a situation where there have been some areas of Samoa's democracy that have not been clearly ironed out. If you were to go back into the Constitutional Convention discussions, a very good account of it is by J.W. Davidson, who is a lawyer from Wellington, by the way, who was instrumental in forming the Constitution of Samoa. And look at the discussions that were happening then. They understood that a number of the institutions in Samoa's political system, there were some very vague understandings about what their powers would be. So just go back and have a little look at the history to understand this was a complicated constitution to draft, because you had the traditional Samoa being merged with the Westminster system. And so what we're seeing now is a number of these issues that may have laid, beneath the surface for the 40 years of stability we've had, they've now come to the fore because of the fact you have these factors coming together to produce the situation we have now. The last factor that I think is important is the knife-edge election result. The HRPP went into these elections clearly thinking they were going to get another landslide. I think the number that Prime Minister Tulepa threw out before the election was 43. And they took their confidence from the fact that so many candidates were running under the HRPP banner. And obviously, in hindsight, that was misplaced confidence. So you get an election where you get 24 FAST members. You have to remember that Fuimaono ran as an independent and Tuala ran as an independent. So the actual numbers are 24 FAST, 25 HRPP, with 2 independents that pledged their allegiance to FAST. Okay, so we have a knife-edge election result. If you had a 28-23, I doubt the HRPP would have a strong case if it was 28-23 in favour of FAST, or vice versa. But the way it's sat with effectively 26 for FAST, 25 for HRPP, with the Article 44 providing for the 6th woman, you've got a perfect storm for a crisis happening, because neither party is now willing to back down, okay, with that close a margin. And right from the beginning, this was the HRPP's argument. There is a 6th woman that should sit. The courts have now found in their favour. So their argument from the beginning has weight. So you've got these different factors working to produce a situation. I wrote this article, it was about a month or so ago, so there's been obviously some updates, and I'd like to comment on those. There's been arguments that we should sit now because the numbers have gone drastically in favour of FAST. And that's a good argument to make. I mean, it's clearly that FAST have superior numbers at this time. The other side of the argument is, well, what if the petitions then turn in the favour of the HRPP? Are we going to seesaw between two sides? Is it not best to wait until all the petitions are done and the by-elections are done, we get a clear picture of who's won what and what the numbers are, and then we have the government sit? So that's the other side of the argument. I have heard commentators say, well, we've done it in the past. We've had petitions pending, by-elections pending. We've still, had Parliament sit. That was a very different case scenario. If you were to look at the numbers back then and the number of petitions in play, it's not the same case scenario we have now. Ultimately, I think what will resolve this situation are the traditional institutions. I hear some commentators talking as if the neighbourhood's going to hell with what's just happened. That is so far from the truth. Samoa's stability owes so much to their traditional institutions, and those are still intact. There's still peace and stability in the country. I hear commentators saying people are exhausted. I don't think they've done empirical studies or surveys to see whether people are exhausted about what's happened. There are some who are exhausted, and there are some who want to see this process play out so we can iron out all the issues with the Constitution so that the next time around we're clear on the way forward. So there's a variety of voices in Samoa that are not being heard, and we have to be very careful with some of these very general, broad generalizations about what the Samoan polity is going through. But from all the evidence I've seen, Samoa right now remains a stable country, a peaceful country. Everything is still in order. I know Anna's going to speak about this, but I'm very wary when I hear Henry Puna talk about the Bikatawa Declaration, because as we know, that's a signal, that's a platform for intervention, even though he did highlight the softer part of the Bikatawa. I've had journalists from Samoa Observer write to me and say, should the forum intervene more, do more? And I wrote to them and put it in no uncertain terms, protect Samoa's sovereignty. We are in no way in a situation where our governance system is falling apart. This is a road bump in the Samoan democratic project. And when they come out of it, I'm sure the country will be better off for it because they will have addressed and clarified a lot of these issues. So I think a lot of people need to just calm down a little bit, let the process play out, There's no military in Samoa, I can guarantee you that. We're not heading for any military coup or anything like that. The country is still very peaceful, and we just need to let some of these issues be addressed. I think that's about all I have to say.
Is it okay? Yeah. Right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Anna Powles. Dr. Anna Powles is a senior lecturer at the Centre for Defence and Security Studies at Massey University. And amongst many other things, her current research examines New Zealand foreign and security policy in the Pacific. Okay.
Tēnā koutou katoa and Tolofalawa. Thank you very much to Yolan and to Mani for the opportunity to be here today to talk about this. So I'm going to focus, because my research focus is very much around crisis management in the region. I'm going to focus on the regional reactions to and the implications of the constitutional crisis in Samoa, because they haven't taken place in a vacuum. And political instability in Samoa, and acknowledging obviously what Iati has just said with respect to stability and peace in Samoa, it still does have significant implications for the region itself more broadly. So I'm going to speak to those regional reactions first, followed by consideration of the examinations. So firstly, the reactions from New Zealand and Australia have been fairly uniform, identical in tone, but reflecting different domestic political realities. In both cases, there were initial calls to Samoa to uphold the rule of law and respect the democratic process. And early statements by Prime Minister Ardern appeared acutely mindful of New Zealand's role as administrator prior to Samoa's independence in 1962, so those former colonial legacies there. And Ardern's initial statements cited New Zealand's respect for the sovereignty of Samoa, the mana of Samoa's democratic institutions, and stated that New Zealand is not in a position to intervene in the political crisis. In more recent statements, Australian Foreign Minister Maurice Payne, in response to the Samoan Court of Appeal ruling on the 2nd of June, urged all parties to cooperate with a view to convening Parliament and enabling the formation of government. And Aotearoa's Foreign Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, tweeted a similar statement around that time, recognising the Supreme Court of Samoa's decision and the Court of Appeal ruling. And Mahuta also called on all parties to work together to convene Parliament and enable the formation of government, notably using the words "without further delay." And in a tweet on the 10th of July, Minister Mahuta stated that Aotearoa acknowledges the patience of the people of Samoa, which again reflects an acknowledgement of frustration with the political impasse. So Minister Mahuta's language has shifted and is noticeably stronger than initial statements by the New Zealand government. Initial statements by Ardern made no reference to the 1962 Treaty of Friendship between New Zealand and Samoa. However, in Mahuta's tweet on the 10th of July, she referenced the Treaty of Friendship along with kotahitanga, or shared objectives and unity, which is one of the 4 values that Mahuta has put forward as underpinning New Zealand's foreign policy approach. So there's a degree of alignment that has emerged between Australian and New Zealand statements, between Payne and Mahuta particularly, which have reflected the critical role of Samoa, and particularly Tuilepa himself, the role that they have played over the past decade or so in supporting and strengthening the regional architecture, governance architecture and diplomatic architecture. And this is also evidenced by Mahuta's reference to kotahitanga, in this case, the shared objectives between New Zealand and Samoa for a secure and prosperous Pacific. And the joint statement by Payne and Australia's Minister for International Development and Pacific, Zed Sasoja, in June also referenced Australia's cooperation with Samoa in promoting a stable, inclusive and prosperous region. And this very much speaks to the role that Samoa has played regionally for so many years. But there is, however, a key sort of fundamental difference between Canberra and Wellington, as reflected by Ardern's careful language at the outset of the crisis, that in the Pacific, New Zealand foreign policy is domestic policy for New Zealand. And in the case of Samoa, this is even more acutely felt. And politician and councillor Efito Collins said this at the very outset, that the standoff in Samoa is causing division in the diaspora here in Aotearoa. So second, the response from the Pacific Island Forum, the preeminent political organisation in the region, has been cautious, slow and non-committal. And this in turn reflects the current state of regional diplomacy. And it's that intersection between a constitutional crisis in Samoa and what is happening within the regional architecture, which is particularly fascinating. So this is the first regional crisis on the new Secretary General's watch. And for most of it, Henry Puna, the former Cook Islands Prime Minister, now new Secretary General, has been holed up in Auckland, unable to travel to Suva, where the headquarters of the PIF lies, obviously to the outbreak in Fiji. Now, considerable efforts have been made, in part driven by key individuals outside the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat structure, as well as others around, to resolve the crisis in Samoa. In March, a political dialogue mechanism was established to facilitate talks between the forum and other actors, and this has certainly been a key element to this. In mid-May, Puna made a fairly sort of boilerplate statement grouped within a broader statement on the forum's focus on family and the values of regionalism, where he emphasised the role of Samoa in resolving the crisis and stated that the forum stands ready to offer Samoa support and help if requested. And again, that encouraging all parties to pursue peaceful means, etc. Noticeably absent from Puna's statement was reference to upholding the rule of law and democratic processes, despite the forum having the tools and language to do so. And here I'm going to disagree slightly with my fellow panelist, Iati, in respect to this. So the Bikitawa Declaration, which Iati has just mentioned. So in 2000, the Pacific Island Forum members, as signatories to the Bikitawa, agreed and committed to upholding democratic processes in institutions, a peaceful transfer of power, the rule of law, and the independence of the judiciary, and just and honest government. And Tuilepa himself, alongside Australia and New Zealand, was one of the champions of the Bikitawa Declaration. Now, the Bikitawa Declaration doesn't mean intervention. There is a whole scope of actions and activities that can take place before that, and it doesn't even necessarily lead to that, as we have seen in other cases in the Pacific. So in July, Puna did make a second statement, which did for the first time reference the Bikitawa Declaration, and he cited the commitment that forum members made to upholding those guiding principles and values. But the statement fell short of actually suggesting any action would be taken under the auspices of the Bikitawa. And the kind of options that could be canvassed include an eminent persons group, a fact-finding mission, third-party mediation, support for the appropriate institutions or mechanisms to assist a resolution, and even simply a convening of foreign ministers to discuss the crisis. So there are certainly options there which are which do not necessarily lead to any kind of intervention as such, but rather supporting Samoa, which has been such a bedrock within the regional system in terms of democracy and stability. So, which brings me to the third point, is that reactions from across the Pacific reflect the current tensions within the regional architecture itself. And the crisis in Samoa, the constitutional crisis in Samoa, is taking place at a time when the Pacific Island Forum is facing its greatest challenge since it was established 50 years ago in 1971. And in February this year, as many of you I'm sure are familiar with, following the election by secret ballot of Henry Puna as Secretary General of the Forum over the Micronesian candidate Gerald Zacchaeus, who's the Marshallese ambassador to the United States, Four of the five Micronesian members, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Nauru, kept to their word and announced that they would begin the year-long process of withdrawal from the forum. And Kiribati, the fifth Micronesian member state, has not yet begun that process. The Micronesian states had made their intentions very clear at least 18 months prior to this at the 2020 Micronesian Presidents Summit, where the leaders released the Macarios communique, which warned that Micronesian states saw no value in participating in the forum should it fail to honour the existing so-called arrangement of sub-regional rotation for the top position. So what is the connection, therefore, between what's happening with respect to the Pacific Islands Forum and the constitutional crisis in Samoa? Well, it was very interesting that after the elections in Samoa, that three of the five Micronesian states actually moved very quickly to acknowledge the April 9th election result in favour of Fiame Matafa and the subsequent political crisis in Samoa. So Micronesia announced its formal recognition of Fiame as the newly elected Prime Minister of Samoa in a statement which made a pointed reference to Micronesians being brave and proactive, and curiously was very much devoid of the softening language of family, which we often see in communications between Pacific leaders. Palau's president also congratulated Fiame and said he was disappointed in Tuilepa's conduct. And the Marshall Islands followed with a statement emphasising the importance of the rule of law and democratic values and so on. And the former Marshallese president, Hilda Hene, congratulated Fiame and heralded this as a win for Pacific women. So a lot of these statements actually kind of went against a lot of convention in the region. Pacific leaders do not generally comment on the domestic politics of their neighbours. The policy of non-interference is certainly there, although there are obvious precedents where that hasn't necessarily been upheld. But the messaging from the North Pacific, from the Micronesian states, reflected these ongoing tensions surrounding the rift within the Pacific Islands Forum, in part geographical, but also in part intergenerational as well, as we have this younger generation of leaders across the Pacific who are flexing their muscles against the old guard, Tuilepa being one of those. So not surprisingly, no other Pacific leaders have publicly commented, although the wires have been running hot across the region. So third, the regional implications of the political crisis in Samoa are significant and may in fact contribute to growing concerns about the legitimacy of the forum and calls to reconfigure the regional architecture. And if the crisis becomes more protracted and the both formal and informal shuttle diplomacy that's taking place across the region isn't enough to support a resolution, and of course acknowledging the fact that it will only be resolved by those traditional mechanisms within Samoa itself. But Fiame, for example, has already called on Australia and New Zealand to take tougher action in response to this, and she very well may do again, potentially even calling on the forum to assist, which would potentially also mean, given Puna's last statement, drawing on the options for action outlined in the Bikitawa. Now, the forum itself cannot afford to be absent in this conversation, and Puna's statements are fairly cautious, are very much kind of a missed opportunity to actually show regional leadership at a time when the region is entering a potentially transformative period. So we have all these things happening at the same time, which is why none of this happens in a vacuum. We have the rift with the Micronesian states splintering away from the Pacific Islands Forum, the review of the regional architecture, the development of the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, and a possible reform process for the election for the top job at the forum itself, and of course the devastating impact, economic and social impact of COVID-19. Puna's challenge on this issue is in part due to Tuilepa's support for his candidacy for the role of Secretary General, but also reflects a broader sentiment across the region where leaders have been unwilling to publicly criticise Tuilepa out of respect for the regional leadership that he has shown in the past, a legacy which, as many have told me, is now irrevocably damaged. The Micronesian President Summit continues to call for Puna to step down. Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister, James Marape, has stepped up, actually, in an effort to mediate with scheduled visits to the Micronesian states, starting with Palau next week. And what this has meant is that the focus has been very much split across these issues, particularly within the Pacific Islands Forum, but also more broadly. So to close, it is clear that there is this emerging intersection between the constitutional crisis in Samoa and a potential crisis of legitimacy and leadership at the Pacific Islands Forum. And this is taking place against, as I mentioned, both COVID, but also those geopolitical dynamics which are increasingly placing pressure on regional resilience itself. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. We've got a very short 10 minutes now for any questions or comments. And because we've got a few people listening in on Zoom, I just would kindly ask that whoever's speaking, if you could just place this on the desk in front of you. It's just a microphone so that it gets captured properly on Zoom. So if anyone's got any questions or comments for our panel. Yes.
Do I need that?
It could help for the recording. Can I throw it? I'll try. Yeah. Sorry, just before you start, sir, I'll just see if I could take 2 or 3 for the panel. Yes, here afterwards. Do I have 3 going? Let's start with those 2, please.
Thank you very much for those moving explanations for a very sensitive issue. I am Samoan and I'm very emotional being here and just remembering forefathers that fought for the land and so that's how I feel. But I just want to make a comment, maybe a good comment after. But intervention, I won't comment too much, but I feel that there's some sort of intervention that should be from the discussions. Some sort, I don't know, not to the extent that will like put shame on Samoans and Indians how they rule because they're Samoan political culture and they should follow, but some sort. I can't comment. I don't know what that is. The second comment is that Iati, I do understand that you're saying that Samoa is still peaceful. That's fine, and I still like to think like that too. That's why I don't want to watch Facebook all the time because that's where I get at night. But I got sick of it. I said, leave it to the judiciary. I believe that it will solve it. Hopefully, it will solve it. But the longer we leave it, I think the worse it gets. Now, just yesterday, I saw the Facebook. We wanted the secretary for the HRPP who filed a complaint about removing his Chief Justice. And I think he went to court yesterday and voiced that in the court. And then he nearly had a scuffle with a principal from FAST. And then he was speaking with that type of language that caretaker Balinese speaks, very derogative language. And I can tell you that because I listen, I don't want to listen to it. And I think they are going to use that language in the court. The police didn't intervene. I don't think the police intervened. Second part of that, the police commissioner in Samoa has disappeared. I think he's gone overseas for sickness purposes. This is a big time for Samoa for him to be there. You know, I don't, whether it's real or not, I can't comment on that, but It's just this is a very tough time for some. So my comment is, yeah, we want Samoa to be peaceful. At the moment, we're going no army. That's fine, no army, of course. We rely on the police, but you know, the longer we leave this, the worse it might be. So those little scuffles like that in the court, it's not the first one. But having now the secretary of the HRDP doing that in the middle, but they're doing that before like that, it's not good to listen. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you could please just pass the microphone down here. We have this gentleman and then Petra, and then we'll just hand over to our panel for some final comments after that. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. First, Anna, you mentioned 4 things that could be done by the forum: eminent persons mission, fact-finding mission, and the convening of foreign ministers. But I think the 4th one was I think there's more reasons to be concerned than you're expressing. First, about the behaviour of the head of state. Second, about the challenge to the courts. And thirdly, about the unwillingness to accept the election results. Although I certainly agree with you against intervention, Ramsey style. What Dylan said, the recommendations at the end, I'm not sure about the argument for limits to prime ministers. That's usually in presidential systems, in prime ministerial systems, that's usual. Certainly, I don't think there's any guarantee that mixed member proportional representation would have produced an outcome that is what you're expecting as regards to those various bills.
Thank you. It's Butler. I'm a colleague of Molly's. Starting with Anna, so you put it more towards what's happening in the forum. Do you have any view on a more of a reset? Because the reason that was given for the constitutional amendment was making Samoa more Samoan. And we have actually seen the same in Tonga, because Tonga also passed now legislation which actually makes Tonga more Tonga, allowing customary law to throughout the entire, every judgment, the judges being able to use customary law whenever they think fit. Sorry. So are we not seeing maybe something which comes more from the Trumpian kind of making American first again? Is one question. Are we seeing this in the Pacific? And then I agree with John Iati that I think it's a little bit more complicated, and I want to really stress, especially for New Zealand audience, Samoa has a constitution as in the supreme entrenched. So the courts actually have a position which is absolutely equal. Yeah, they can strike down legislation to any of the other 2 arms of government. So actually criticizing the court, the judiciary in a system like that is normally or often the beginning of the end. Yeah, so it's far more worse than Michael Cullen at the time, criticizing China lies and the seabed and short judgment, which was probably bad enough. But this is actually in a constitutional system like Samoa, a really, really bad issue.
Thank you very much, Petra. I'm so sorry in these lunchtime seminars, the time just always runs so quickly, but I would just like to ask the panel very briefly, maybe a minute or so each, for any response or further comments.
All right. Let me start with the first one about international intervention. Well, the question is, have they tried going to the customary political institutions? I haven't seen that step taken yet. So before we even talk about international intervention, remember Samoa's system is built on a merger of customary and the Westminster system. So you would think the logical next step is to go to the customary route first, before we even talk about any international intervention, whether they've been in the person's group, etc. So I think that'd be the logical way to go. I mean, if you're from Samoa, you know, if you're in Lee's village, it's just down the road from Tula Epis.
Well, I think they tried. They had meetings in first or by Tula Epis, but I'm naming like it's Samoa company.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a complicated situation. I'm not off the view that things are going to hell, as some people say. So, look, In 1982, we had 3 changes of government. You know, we got through that and we were better off for at least 3 decades. This is the same thing we're going to see now, is we're going to get through this and we're going to be better off for at least 3 decades. Are there parameters of institutions, different institutions pushing parameters of their powers? Obviously, but you know, those are things that are to be ironed out. For those who don't understand, Samoa was the first country to get democracy in the Pacific, but that was only in Westminster system, early 1962. Since 1962, Samoa has had to adopt the Westminster system, make it function, has had to adopt numerous development programs, make them function, has had to become multilateral, join international organizations, understand how to deal with regional and international geopolitics. I think people need to step back and take a bigger picture approach to what's happening in the Pacific. These countries have had to make a lot of things work that Western countries took centuries to do. So should we expect everything to be perfect in Pacific Island countries? Under those circumstances, I would argue no. I would expect that you would have some kind of crises along the way. We've seen much worse in the Pacific with, you know, coups and almost civil wars. So this bump in the road, I think history will judge who is correct on this. But this, in my view, is just a bump in the road that needs to be sorted out. And future elections will be better off for it because we'll iron out all these issues.
Thank you so much. Anna.
Thanks, Marnie. Just quickly at 50, John, the 5 options prior to even getting to the point of discussing other more pointy-edged options is the eminent persons group, fact-finding mission, third-party mediation, support for institutions, and all mechanisms in order to support a resolution and convening a high-level meeting. Would have formerly been under the Foreign Regional Security Committee, but now not necessarily in that space. With respect to intervention, now I think it's really important to point out that from my perspective and looking at how intervention has played out in the region, there isn't, from what I can tell, the appetite for any kind of military-style boots on the ground intervention in Samoa. The geopolitics of the region don't necessarily support that. The ambitions of the 2 major countries who would be contributing to that, namely Australia and New Zealand, there is very little appetite in Canberra or Wellington for anything like that. And there are a whole host of other options to support Samoa in this process of resolving the crisis. That was all.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Very quickly, last word. Yes.
Just thank you, brother, also here for the comments. I completely agree. And just in response, I completely agree. It won't be the silver bullet solution, MMP, but it will, I think, drastically reduce the likelihood as we saw here in Aotearoa.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Really quickly, on behalf of the center, thanks very much for coming. Thanks to our speakers, and thanks very much to Marnie. We're about to be kicked out of the room, but I invite you to have a look at the website and keep an eye for future events. See you soon. Thanks.